The first call came in just after dawn. Dispatcher Carla Ruiz had handled hundreds of emergency calls, but there was something different in the homeowner's voice. Raw, frantic desperation. "There's a puppy stuck in the drain. It's been crying all night." The woman's breath hitched. "Please, you have to hurry." Within minutes, the fire department was on the road, sirens slicing through the quiet morning air. Veteran firefighter Jake Holloway tightened his gloves, his mind already mapping out the usual steps. Animal rescues weren't uncommon, and most of the time, they ended with a relieved pet owner and a wagging tail. Still, something about this case made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The team pulled up to a quiet suburban street, where a woman in a robe stood near the curb, clutching a phone with white-knuckled fingers. "I heard it last night," she said before they could even ask. "At first, I thought it was a raccoon, but then it started whimpering. I tried calling for it, but the poor thing's trapped deep inside." Jake crouched by the storm drain and listened. Faint but unmistakable, the soft, pleading cries of a puppy echoed up from the darkness. He peered into the opening, a narrow, rust-lined tunnel vanishing into blackness. "We'll get him out," he assured her. The crew worked fast, setting up floodlights and preparing rescue tools. Mike, the team's smallest firefighter, was the obvious choice to go in. He pulled on a harness and crawled forward, his flashlight beam bouncing off wet concrete. "Got eyes on him," he called back after a few feet. "Looks like a golden retriever pup, covered in mud. He's stuck, but I think I can reach." He stopped. Jake stiffened. "Mike." A pause, then, "There's something else in here." The words hit like a gut punch. The team exchanged glances. "What do you mean?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't know," Mike murmured. "It's just watching me." The air thickened. The woman on the curb gasped. Jake grabbed another flashlight and angled it into the drain, but the beam barely penetrated the tunnel's depth. "Mike, what do you see?" A shuffle of movement, then, eyes. Right behind the puppy. Every muscle in Jake's body went taut. "What kind of eyes?" A deep breath. "Too big for a raccoon. Too still for a rat." Then, as if the thing inside the tunnel had been waiting for this moment, it moved. Not a scurry. Not a retreat. A slow, deliberate shift, just enough to confirm it wasn't an illusion. The puppy let out a sharp yelp and scrambled forward, but something unseen held it back. Mike sucked in a breath. "It's not letting him go." The words sent an icy ripple through the team. Jake straightened. "Get out of there. Now." Mike didn't argue. He twisted back toward the opening, boots scraping against the damp concrete. The moment he moved, the thing in the drain reacted. A low, unnatural noise vibrated through the tunnel, something between a growl and a whisper. Jake barely had time to register it before Mike tumbled out, eyes wide, breathing hard. Silence swallowed the street. The puppy's whimpering continued, more desperate now. Jake turned to his team. "We're not leaving that dog in there." No one argued. They adjusted their approach. If someone, or something, was down there, they weren't going in blind. A rescue camera was snaked into the tunnel, its grainy feed displaying on a portable monitor. At first, all they saw was shifting mud, the puppy's trembling form, and the enclosing walls of the tunnel. Then, the feed flickered. A shape appeared behind the dog. Too large for a typical drain-dwelling animal. Too still to be anything natural. And just as Jake leaned in to get a better look, the screen went black. The puppy let out a final, strangled cry. And then, silence. The silence stretched. Jake Holloway's pulse pounded in his ears as the static-filled rescue camera screen flickered. The feed was dead. The only sound was the soft, rhythmic drip of water from the drain, punctuated by the occasional sharp whimper from the trapped puppy. Mike knelt beside the storm drain, hands braced on the slick concrete, chest heaving. He wasn't the type to scare easily, but his face was pale, his fingers clenched as if trying to ground himself in reality. "There was something down there," he murmured. "I swear to God, Jake, I saw it move." Jake tightened his jaw. And now the camera's out. He didn't like coincidences. The rest of the crew exchanged wary glances. Even the bystanders who had gathered, neighbors drawn by the commotion, shifted uneasily. It was just a dog rescue. A simple retrieval. So why did the air feel heavy, thick with something unseen? Jake grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, we need backup. Bring additional lighting, a thermal scanner, and," he hesitated, then added, "PD, just in case." "Copy that," the dispatcher responded. A breath. A glance at the tunnel. Then he crouched beside Mike, lowering his voice. "What else did you see?" Mike swallowed hard. "I don't know. It was just watching. Like it was waiting." Jake exhaled sharply through his nose. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't put stock in local legends, but there was no denying that something felt wrong. The puppy let out another cry, weaker this time. Enough waiting. Jake pulled a long rescue pole from the truck, its noose-like end designed to slip over an animal's body. If they could loop it around the pup and pull it out without anyone crawling back inside, all the better. "All right," he said. "Let's get him out." He fed the pole into the tunnel slowly, inch by inch, adjusting as the metal scraped against the narrow walls. The floodlights illuminated the entrance, but beyond a few feet, the darkness swallowed everything. Then, contact. Jake felt the slight resistance, the warmth of fur. "I got him," he breathed, carefully tightening the loop. The puppy whimpered, shifting slightly, but something was wrong. Jake could feel it in the weight, in the way the pole resisted. It wasn't pulling free. A sharp tug. Nothing. Another, more forceful. The pole wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding the dog in place. "Jake," Mike whispered. Jake gritted his teeth and yanked harder. The pole wrenched free, empty. A sharp, guttural noise echoed from the tunnel. Not the puppy. Not human. The team jolted backward. A ripple of gasps and murmurs spread through the onlookers. And then, without warning, the floodlights flickered. A short burst of static crackled through Jake's radio before cutting out completely. The puppy yelped, high, desperate, then silence. Jake's stomach clenched. "We need that camera back online." Technician Adam Kent was already on it, reconnecting the feed with shaking hands. After a few tense seconds, the monitor flickered back to life. Everyone crowded around. The grainy image showed the tunnel's damp, narrow walls, the thick mud coating the ground. The puppy lay trembling near the center of the frame, eyes darting, body hunched low. Behind it, something shifted. A shape, barely distinguishable in the darkness. Not an animal. Not quite a person. Jake felt his blood turn cold. "Zoom in," he ordered. Adam adjusted the controls. The image sharpened just enough to reveal details that made the breath in Jake's lungs freeze. A tangle of fabric. A pale, unmoving hand. A face, gaunt, sunken, frozen in time. Then, with a sickening, unnatural jerk, the figure moved. The screen cut to black. The only sound left was the low, distant howl of wind through the tunnel. The camera feed was gone again. No one spoke. No one moved. It was as if the entire street had been frozen in place, suspended between reality and something far more unsettling. Jake Holloway forced himself to breathe. The fire captain had been through hellish blazes, near collapses, and rescues that tested the limits of human endurance. But nothing had ever made his skin crawl like this. A body. The thought settled into his chest like a stone. It had been there, unmoving, wrapped in decayed fabric, its skin pale and untouched by time. But then it had moved. Not a trick of the light. Not a flicker of static. It had moved. The puppy's whimpering echoed faintly from the drain, snapping Jake back to reality. He turned to Adam. "Try the feed again." Adam swallowed hard, fingers fumbling over the controls. I don't know what happened. It just..." "Try again," Jake repeated, voice like iron. The crew stood rigid, waiting. The bystanders had backed away from the scene, whispering among themselves, their curiosity quickly turning to fear. The screen flickered. Then, finally, the feed returned. Jake leaned in. The puppy was still there, trembling against the curved wall of the tunnel. But the figure was gone. His stomach clenched. "Where the hell did it go?" Mike whispered. "You saw it, right?" "We all saw it." No one answered. The unease spread, thick as fog. Then a new sound cut through the quiet, the distant wail of approaching sirens. Backup had arrived. A police cruiser rolled to a stop, followed by another rescue unit. The lead officer, Detective Nora Grayson, stepped out, taking in the scene with sharp, calculating eyes. "Somebody tell me what's going on." Jake turned to her. "We were called for an animal rescue. Puppies trapped. But there's something else down there." Nora raised an eyebrow. "Define something else." Jake hesitated. He could still see the shape on the monitor, the impossible stillness of its limbs, the way it had just vanished. But how could he explain that without sounding insane? Instead, he took a slow breath. "A body." Nora stiffened. "You're sure?" He gave a grim nod. "Until it wasn't there anymore." Silence. "Then, you're telling me a body just up and walked away?" No one answered. Finally, she sighed, signaling to her officers. "We're getting that tunnel searched." The fire department's thermal scanner was deployed first, its infrared imaging sweeping the underground passage. The readings came back strangely muted, distorted. It picked up the puppy's heat signature clearly. But beyond that, nothing. No second figure. No source for the movement they had all witnessed. The officers lowered a high-powered flashlight into the drain. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing slick concrete, streaks of mud, and the terrified dog huddled near the far wall. Nothing else. Jake clenched his fist. He knew what he'd seen. Then, just as one of the officers began climbing into the tunnel, Adam gasped. "Wait, check the footage again." The rescue team and officers crowded around the monitor as Adam replayed the last 10 seconds of the feed before it had gone black. There. The moment before the screen had cut out. The figure, still wrapped in fabric, had begun to turn. And as it moved, something came into view. A hand. Not just any hand. A small, delicate one, clutching something tightly, something metallic, something glinting under the dim light. A bracelet. Nora went pale. "Pause that. Zoom in." Adam obeyed. The image sharpened, bringing the bracelet into clear focus. An inscription was barely visible along the surface. Faded but still legible. Nora whispered the words aloud, her voice barely above a breath. The name of a missing person. A case from 10 years ago. A person who had vanished without a trace. And if the image was to be believed, they hadn't aged a day. The bracelet's inscription sent a ripple of disbelief through the team. Nora Grayson's face was unreadable, but her fingers twitched at her side, betraying the storm behind her sharp eyes. The name engraved on the metal was one she knew well, one the entire town had tried to forget. Lillian Carter. She had disappeared a decade ago. A case that had gone cold, buried under years of unanswered questions. No leads. No witnesses. Just a 17-year-old girl who had left her house one evening and never returned. And now, her bracelet had been found wrapped around the wrist of something that shouldn't exist. The air felt heavier, thick with unspoken fears. Jake exhaled, his throat dry. "Tell me that's a coincidence." Nora didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned to one of her officers. "Pull up her case file. Now." The officer hesitated before nodding and stepping away. Meanwhile, the puppy's whimpering had grown softer. Time was running out. "We need to go in," Jake said firmly. Nora hesitated. "You really want to send someone in after what we just saw?" "I don't leave people behind. And I sure as hell don't leave dogs." A tense beat passed before she sighed. "Fine. But we do this carefully." Jake grabbed a harness, securing himself with a thick rope as 2 other firefighters prepared to lower him in. He didn't need a camera this time. He would see for himself. As he crawled forward, the scent of damp earth and stagnant water filled his nose. The tunnel walls closed in, forcing him to move on his elbows, flashlight gripped tightly in one hand. Then he saw the puppy. It was barely breathing, its tiny body pressed against the cold concrete. "Almost there, buddy," Jake whispered, reaching out. The moment his fingers brushed its fur, something shifted in the darkness. A whisper of movement. He froze. The air turned frigid, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched crawled up his spine. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head. Just beyond the reach of his flashlight, something stood in the shadows. Lillian Carter. Or at least, something that looked like her. Her skin was too pale, untouched by the years that should have passed. Her hair clung to her face in damp strands. Her lips moved soundlessly, as if whispering words she no longer knew how to form. And her eyes, hollow, lost, trapped somewhere between life and death. Jake's breath hitched. Lillian. The name barely left his lips before she moved. Not walking, gliding, her feet soundless against the wet ground. The air around her seemed to distort, as if time itself wavered in her presence. Jake's instincts screamed at him to retreat. But she wasn't attacking. She was pointing. Her trembling hand lifted, directing him toward something deeper in the tunnel. And then, just as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. The tunnel was empty. Only the puppy remained, blinking up at him with wide, exhausted eyes. Jake didn't think. He scooped up the dog and turned back, crawling as fast as the confined space allowed. The moment he emerged into the open air, he gasped, filling his lungs with deep, desperate breaths. The crew pulled him to his feet as the puppy shivered in his arms. "You all right?" Mike asked, his face pale. Jake could barely process what had just happened. He turned to Nora. "She's still in there." Nora's expression hardened, but she didn't question him. "Seal off this area," she ordered her officers. "No one else goes in until we figure out what the hell is going on." As the team worked around him, Jake glanced down at the puppy in his arms. Its tiny body trembled, but it was safe now. And deep in the tunnels, where time had stood still for a decade, a girl who had been forgotten by the world had finally been found.